Section 1. The Tyranny of Darkness and the Cult of the Night. The night of December 7th, 1941. A curtain of profound darkness falls upon the Pacific Ocean, a vast and unforgiving expanse that for centuries had been governed by the cycles of the moon and the wisdom of the stars. In the age of sail, darkness was a sanctuary, a time for caution and reprieve. But in the 20th century, with the advent of steel behemoths capable of traversing continents of water at speeds unimaginable to their forebears, the night transformed. It became a new dimension of conflict, a realm of shadow and surprise, where the keenest eye and the steadiest hand could achieve victory against a technologically superior, yet blind, adversary. In the early stages of the Great Pacific Conflict, no one understood this better. No one had mastered the art of nocturnal warfare with more dedication, discipline, and devastating effect than the Imperial Japanese Navy. Their philosophy was not merely tactical, it was deeply ingrained in their martial culture. Night was not an obstacle to be overcome, but an ally to be embraced, a cloak that magnified their strengths and masked their few weaknesses. For the sailors of the combined fleet, the darkness was a canvas upon which they would paint masterpieces of naval strategy, using torpedoes as their brushstrokes and the silhouettes of enemy ships as their fleeting subjects. This was a doctrine born of necessity and perfected through relentless, arduous training. Japan, a nation with limited industrial capacity compared to the colossal manufacturing might of the United States, knew it could not win a prolonged war of attrition. It could not match the American industrial base, ship for ship, or gun for gun. Therefore, its strategy was predicated on achieving decisive, crippling blows early in the conflict, shattering the enemy's will to fight through a series of swift, impeccably executed battles. The night was the chosen arena for these decisive actions. The training regimen for Japanese naval crews was legendary in its intensity. Sailors were drilled for countless hours in night observation. They spent endless nights on the windswept bridges of their cruisers and destroyers, their eyes straining to pierce the gloom, learning to distinguish the subtle shadow of a ship from a cloud on the horizon, the faint phosphorescence of a wake from the natural glimmer of the sea. They competed in spotting drills, their performance meticulously recorded and rewarded. The best lookouts, men with almost preternatural night vision, were celebrated figures, their skills as vital to the ship's combat effectiveness as the gunnery officer or the chief engineer. This human element was the first pillar of their nocturnal supremacy. They trained their senses to a razor's edge, creating a generation of sailors who could navigate and fight in conditions that would leave their counterparts bewildered and disoriented. They learned to trust their eyes and their instincts above all else, eschewing the nascent and often unreliable electronic aids of the era. Their navigators could fix their position with uncanny accuracy, using little more than a sextant and the faint light of the stars, allowing them to converge on a target point with a precision that stunned their adversaries. This mastery of the fundamentals gave them a quiet confidence, a sense of belonging in the dark, while for many others, the night was a source of anxiety and confusion. The second, and arguably more formidable pillar of their night fighting doctrine, was a technological marvel, a weapon so far ahead of its time that it would dominate the early naval battles of the Pacific: the Type 93 torpedo. Known to the Allies by the later, grudgingly respectful moniker, Long Lance, this was not merely a torpedo, it was a revolution in naval ordnance. A standard American destroyer torpedo of the era, the Mark 15, carried a warhead of approximately 800 pounds and had a maximum effective range of about 6,000 yards at its fastest setting. It was a problematic weapon, plagued by technical issues with its depth-keeping and magnetic detonators. The Type 93, by contrast, was an entirely different class of weapon. It was a massive, 24-inch diameter behemoth, nearly 30 feet long. It carried a warhead of over 1,000 pounds of powerful explosive, enough to cripple or sink even a heavy cruiser with a single hit. But its most astonishing characteristic was its propulsion system. Instead of the compressed air and alcohol mixture used in Western torpedoes, which left a telltale trail of bubbles on the surface, the Type 93 was fueled by pure, compressed oxygen. This highly volatile but incredibly efficient propellant system endowed the Long Lance with two war-winning attributes. Firstly, it was virtually wakeless, making it almost impossible to spot as it raced towards its target, a silent specter in the dark water. Secondly, and most critically, it gave the torpedo an unprecedented range. At a high-speed setting of nearly 50 knots, it could strike a target 22,000 yards away. At a more moderate, yet still fast, 36 knots, its reach extended to a staggering 44,000 yards, or over 20 nautical miles. This capability was so far beyond what Allied naval planners believed was possible that they initially refused to accept it. When reports came in of Allied ships being struck by torpedoes fired from an unseen enemy far over the horizon, they were often dismissed as the result of submarines, mines, or even internal explosions. The concept of a surface-launched torpedo with the range of a battleship's main guns seemed like a fantasy. This technological gap created a fatal tactical asymmetry. Japanese destroyers and cruisers could launch a devastating salvo of these weapons from the safety of the darkness, long before they were even within the effective gunnery range of their American or Allied counterparts. Their entire night battle tactic was built around this weapon. A Japanese task force would approach its target under the cover of darkness, guided by its expert navigators and eagle-eyed lookouts. Upon making contact, often visually identifying the enemy fleet before they themselves were seen, they would turn in unison, presenting their broadsides to unleash a coordinated, overwhelming wave of long lances. After firing, they would immediately turn away and withdraw at high speed, leaving a spread of unseen, wakeless torpedoes to run their deadly course. The Allied fleet, often completely unaware it was even under attack, would suddenly be rocked by a series of catastrophic explosions. By the time they could react, by the time their gun crews could even be brought to readiness, the Japanese force would have vanished back into the impenetrable darkness from which it came. It was a silent, efficient, and terrifyingly effective method of naval combat, a perfect fusion of human skill, daring tactics, and superior technology. It was the art of the Ghost Fleet, and in the dark waters of the Solomon Islands in 1942, this art would reach its terrible, awe-inspiring zenith, leaving a trail of sunken ships and shattered confidence in its wake, and forcing the United States Navy into a desperate race to find a way to see in the dark. Section 2. The Ghosts of Ironbottom Sound. The campaign for the Solomon Islands, which began in the late summer of 1942, became the crucible in which the contrasting naval doctrines of Japan and the United States were tested by fire and steel. The strategic prize was a small, partially constructed airfield on the island of Guadalcanal. For the Allies, holding this airstrip, which they would name Henderson Field, was essential to protecting the vital supply lines to Australia. For the Japanese, retaking it was a matter of strategic necessity, a key to halting the first major Allied offensive of the Pacific War. What unfolded was a brutal 6-month struggle of attrition, fought on land, in the air, and, most consequentially, in the dark, island-choked waters that surrounded Guadalcanal. This narrow body of water, flanked by Guadalcanal, Savo Island, and Florida Island, would soon earn a grim and enduring name: Ironbottom Sound, a testament to the dozens of warships from both sides that would be sent to its depths. It was here, in this nocturnal arena, that the Imperial Japanese Navy's mastery of night combat was put on full, devastating display. The Japanese established a highly effective system for reinforcing their beleaguered troops on Guadalcanal. Under the cover of darkness, flotillas of fast destroyers and cruisers would race down the channel between the Solomon Islands, a passage that came to be known as the Slot. This naval shuttle service, dubbed the Tokyo Express by the Americans, delivered fresh troops, ammunition, and supplies almost nightly. And just as quickly, it would withdraw before the sun rose, making it safe for the American aircraft at Henderson Field to resume their patrols. The United States Navy and its allies were tasked with the seemingly straightforward mission of intercepting this nocturnal supply line. They had, on paper, a significant advantage in numbers and firepower. Their fleets often consisted of heavy and light cruisers, supported by a screen of destroyers, all equipped with what was, for the time, standard gunnery and fire control systems. But they were operating under a profound handicap. They were blind. In the moonless, tropical nights of the South Pacific, their lookouts struggled to pierce the oppressive darkness. Their tactics were conventional, relying on gunnery duels at ranges where they could visually identify and target the enemy. They were utterly unprepared for an adversary who could see them first, strike from miles beyond their visual horizon, and then disappear without a trace. The first major test came on the night of August 9, 1942, in what would become known as the Battle of Savo Island. An Allied task force of 8 cruisers and 15 destroyers was positioned to guard the approaches to the American landing zones on Guadalcanal. It was a powerful force, confident in its ability to repel any surface attack. As the fleet settled into its nighttime patrol pattern, a Japanese force of 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer, under the command of Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, was steaming down the Slot at high speed. Mikawa's force was a finely honed instrument of night warfare. His lookouts, perched high in the superstructures of their ships, spotted the Allied fleet long before the Japanese were detected. What followed was not a battle, but a meticulously planned and flawlessly executed ambush. The Japanese force, aided by float planes that dropped flares to silhouette the Allied ships, slipped past the picket destroyers undetected. They then unleashed their long-lance torpedoes from a range of several miles. The first sign of trouble for the unsuspecting Allied crews was a series of massive concussive explosions that ripped through the hulls of their cruisers. The USS Astoria, USS Quincy, and USS Vincennes were all struck by multiple torpedoes and a withering barrage of 8-inch shell fire. In the chaos and confusion, with fires raging and communications severed, the Allied ships struggled to mount any effective response. They fired star shells that failed to illuminate the enemy, and their gunners shot at phantom targets in the darkness. The Japanese cruisers, having delivered their crippling torpedo attack, closed the range and raked the burning Allied ships with gunfire, their gunners expertly trained for night action. The entire engagement lasted little more than 30 minutes. When the Japanese force withdrew, leaving a scene of absolute devastation behind them, they had sunk 4 Allied heavy cruisers and damaged another, all without suffering any significant damage in return. It was one of the most lopsided naval defeats in the history of the United States Navy. The Battle of Savo Island was a brutal lesson in the realities of night combat in the Pacific. It sent a shockwave through the Allied command. Their doctrine, their training, and their technology were clearly inadequate for this new kind of warfare. This pattern of Japanese nocturnal dominance would be repeated time and again in the waters around Guadalcanal. In the Battle of Cape Esperance in October, an American force achieved a measure of success, sinking a Japanese cruiser and destroyer, but it was a confusing, chaotic affair that still resulted in the loss of an American destroyer. The Japanese adapted quickly. Weeks later, in the naval Battle of Guadalcanal, a series of engagements fought over several nights in mid-November, the Japanese once again demonstrated their prowess. In one encounter, a small Japanese force, including only 2 old battleships, ran headlong into an American force of cruisers and destroyers. The ensuing melee, fought at point-blank range, was a brutal brawl. While the Americans managed to sink one of the Japanese battleships, they paid a terrible price, losing 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers. The American admirals commanding these task forces, men like Daniel Callahan and Norman Scott, were lost in the fighting, a testament to the ferocity of these close-quarters night actions. The Japanese were not invincible. They suffered losses, and their Tokyo Express runs were often disrupted. But they consistently inflicted far greater damage than they received in these nighttime surface engagements. Their combination of superior night optics, highly trained crews, a coherent and well-practiced doctrine, and the unparalleled long-lance torpedo gave them an almost insurmountable edge. For the American sailors fighting in Ironbottom Sound, the setting of the sun brought with it a palpable sense of dread. The darkness, which should have been a neutral element, had been weaponized against them. It concealed an enemy who moved like a phantom, struck with devastating force, and then vanished, leaving only burning ships in the cold, dark water of the Sound. This period of humbling defeats forged a grim resolve within the U.S. Navy. They knew they could not win by simply fighting harder. They had to fight smarter. They needed a new tool, a new way of perceiving the battlefield, a technological equalizer that could strip the ghosts of their cloak of invisibility. They needed a way to conquer the night itself. Section 3. The Crucible of Innovation and the Call for a New Eye. The repeated, humbling lessons taught in the dark waters of Ironbottom Sound forced a painful but necessary period of introspection within the United States Navy. The initial shock of the Battle of Savo Island gave way to a grim and urgent analysis of the tactical and technological chasm that separated them from their adversary. It was clear that American naval doctrine, which had long emphasized daylight gunnery duels between heavily armored battle lines, was dangerously outmoded in the close, treacherous confines of the Solomon Islands. Bravery and determination, of which the American sailors had an abundance, were not enough to overcome an enemy who operated on a different sensory plane. The problem was fundamental. The Japanese could see, and the Americans could not. This simple, stark reality became the central challenge for naval strategists and engineers back in the United States. They were locked in a deadly game of blind man's bluff, and the stakes were nothing less than control of the Pacific. The existing tools were proving woefully inadequate. Star shells, which were intended to illuminate the battlefield, often did more harm than good, perfectly silhouetting American ships for the keen-eyed Japanese gunners, while the Japanese fleet remained hidden in the darkness beyond the shell's light. Float planes could be used for scouting, but they were vulnerable, and their presence could give away the position of their parent ships. The searchlights mounted on American warships were powerful, but using them was a double-edged sword. Switching on a searchlight was akin to painting a massive bullseye on oneself, instantly drawing a torrent of enemy fire. The solution, it was becoming increasingly clear, would not come from traditional methods. It would have to be born from the burgeoning field of electronics. The concept of radio detection and ranging, or radar, was not new. Both the Americans and the British had been experimenting with it for years. The British, facing the threat of aerial bombardment, had successfully developed the chain-home system, a network of coastal radar stations that played a pivotal role in the Battle of Britain. The U.S. Navy had also been developing its own radar sets, primarily for early warning against aircraft and for long-range gunnery fire control. Early shipboard radar models, like the CXM, were large, cumbersome, and primarily designed for detecting large targets at great distances. They lacked the precision and resolution needed to navigate treacherous, island-filled waters, or to distinguish between a destroyer and a rocky outcropping on a dark, rainy night. What was needed was a new kind of radar, one that was smaller, more reliable, and capable of providing a clear, detailed picture of the immediate surface environment. It had to be an instrument not just for long-range detection, but for close-in tactical awareness. It had to become the ship commander's all-seeing eye in the blackest of nights. The pressure to develop and deploy such a system was immense. The losses in the Solomons were mounting at an alarming rate. Every night, the Tokyo Express made its run, and every attempt to intercept it seemed to risk another naval disaster. The strategic situation was precarious. If the U.S. Navy could not sever the Japanese supply line to Guadalcanal, the hard-won gains of the Marines on the island could be lost. The entire South Pacific campaign hung in the balance. This sense of crisis accelerated research and development at laboratories across the United States, most notably at the MIT Radiation Laboratory, which became a central hub for microwave radar development. Scientists and engineers worked around the clock, pushing the boundaries of what was technologically possible. They were in a race against time, with every new prototype and every successful test offering a glimmer of hope to the fleets fighting half a world away. The breakthrough came with the development of microwave radar systems, which operated at much higher frequencies than their predecessors. These new systems, particularly the SG, surface search, and SF, a smaller, shorter-range version radars, offered a revolutionary leap in capability. They used a much smaller antenna, often housed in a protective radome, which could be mounted on the mast of even a relatively small ship like a destroyer. More importantly, the shorter wavelengths of microwave radar provided dramatically improved resolution. Instead of showing a vague, indistinct blip on a screen, the new SG radar could paint a surprisingly clear picture of the surrounding area on a planned position indicator, PPI, scope. This circular screen showed the radar-equipped ship at its center, with detected contacts appearing as points of light at their correct range and bearing. An experienced operator could learn to distinguish the sharp, clear return of a warship from the fuzzier, more amorphous return of a landmass. They could see not just one enemy ship, but an entire formation, plotting its course and speed with a degree of accuracy that was previously unimaginable in total darkness. This technology promised to do more than just level the playing field. It promised to invert the tactical dynamic that had so favored the Japanese. The long-lance torpedo was still a formidable weapon, but its effectiveness was predicated on surprise and the ability to launch from an unseen position. Radar threatened to strip away that invisibility. An American task force equipped with SG radar could detect an approaching Japanese force from miles away, long before the Japanese lookouts could hope to spot them. They could track the enemy's movements, anticipate their maneuvers, and prepare a devastating reception. Instead of being the ambushed, the Americans could become the ambushers. They could use the darkness, once their greatest foe, as their own cloak, all the while monitoring their prey on the cool, green glow of a radar screen. But developing the technology was only half the battle. It had to be produced in large quantities. It had to be rugged enough to withstand the rigors of combat at sea. And, most critically, the crews had to be trained to use it, and, even more importantly, to trust it. For a generation of sailors raised to rely on their eyes, the idea of placing their faith in the ghostly electronic apparitions on a flickering screen was a profound mental shift. It required a new kind of seamanship, a new way of thinking about naval warfare. This monumental task of production, installation, and training was underway even as the battles raged in Ironbottom Sound. A new class of warship, then sliding down the slipways in shipyards across America, was being designed from the keel up to be the platform for this new technology. It was a vessel built for speed, firepower, and resilience, a ship that would carry these new electronic eyes into the heart of the night. This was the Fletcher-class destroyer, and its arrival in the Pacific would herald a new era in the war at sea, an era where the tyranny of darkness would finally be broken. Section 4. The Greyhounds of the Fleet, forging the Fletcher-class. While scientists and engineers worked feverishly to perfect the electronic eyes that would pierce the Pacific night, another, more tangible revolution was taking place in the shipyards of America. A new class of warship was being born, a vessel designed to embody the very essence of the U.S. Navy's emerging strategic philosophy: speed, versatility, and technological superiority. This was the Fletcher-class destroyer, a ship that would become one of the most successful and iconic naval designs of the entire conflict. The genesis of the Fletcher-class predated the attack on Pearl Harbor, originating in the late 1930s as the U.S. Navy began to anticipate the storm clouds of a global war. Planners recognized that any future conflict, particularly in the vast expanses of the Pacific, would require a new type of destroyer. The previous classes, like the Benson and Gleaves classes, were good ships, but they were products of interwar treaty limitations. They were compact, somewhat cramped, and had limited room for future upgrades, particularly for the increasingly complex anti-aircraft and electronic systems that were on the horizon. The Navy needed a clean sheet design, a destroyer that was larger, faster, more heavily armed, and, crucially, adaptable enough to incorporate the rapid technological advancements that war would inevitably bring. The result of this forward-thinking design process was the Fletcher-class. When the first ship of the class, the USS Fletcher, DD 445, was commissioned in June of 1942, it represented a quantum leap in American destroyer design. The Fletchers were impressive vessels by any measure. They displaced over 2,000 tons and measured 376 feet in length. Their flush deck design gave them a sleek, powerful silhouette and improved their structural strength, a vital attribute for surviving the punishing conditions of the Pacific. Below the waterline, their hulls were fine-tuned for speed and seakeeping, allowing them to maintain high speeds, even in heavy seas. Powering these Greyhounds of the fleet were 4 massive boilers, feeding 2 geared steam turbines, generating a colossal 60,000 shaft horsepower. This power plant could drive the ships at a top speed of over 35 knots, fast enough to keep pace with the swiftest aircraft carriers and to run down nearly any surface threat. Their endurance was equally impressive, with a range of over 6,500 nautical miles at a cruising speed of 15 knots, allowing them to undertake the long-range patrols and escort missions that would characterize the Pacific War. This combination of speed and range gave fleet commanders immense tactical flexibility, allowing the Fletchers to serve as scouts, pickets, convoy escorts, and frontline combatants. The armament of the Fletcher-class was a formidable blend of anti-surface, anti-aircraft, and anti-submarine capabilities, making them true multi-purpose warships. Their main battery consisted of 5 powerful 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns, housed in single, fully enclosed mounts. This was a superb weapon, equally effective at engaging surface targets like enemy destroyers and cruisers, as it was at throwing up a deadly curtain of flak against attacking aircraft. The enclosed mounts protected the gun crews from the elements and shell splinters, a significant improvement over the open mounts of earlier destroyer classes. The fire from these guns was directed by an advanced Mark 37 gunfire control system, which, when integrated with radar, would provide astonishingly accurate gunnery, even at night or in poor visibility. For close-in air defense, the Fletchers were bristling with weaponry. The initial design was quickly upgunned as the realities of aerial warfare became apparent, and a typical mid-war Fletcher would carry up to 10 40mm Bofors guns and numerous 20mm Oerlikon cannons. This dense wall of automatic fire made them exceedingly dangerous targets for enemy pilots and allowed them to throw a protective screen around the high-value aircraft carriers and battleships they were tasked with escorting. Their offensive punch was rounded out by 2 quintuple banks of 21-inch torpedo tubes, mounted amidships, giving them the ability to deliver a powerful torpedo salvo of their own against enemy capital ships. A comprehensive suite of depth-charge projectors and racks provided their defense against the ever-present submarine threat. However, the most revolutionary aspect of the Fletcher-class was not its guns or its engines, but its design philosophy. It was built with the future in mind. The designers had intentionally incorporated a significant margin of space and stability, anticipating that new and heavier equipment, particularly electronic suites, would need to be added as the war progressed. This foresight proved to be a stroke of genius. It meant that as the new SG and SF radar systems became available, they could be easily installed on the Fletchers without requiring a major redesign or compromising the ship's performance. The Fletcher-class destroyers were, in essence, the first warships designed from the outset to be integrated platforms for advanced electronics. This marriage of a powerful, well-designed hull and cutting-edge sensory technology would prove to be a war-winning combination. The industrial effort required to produce these ships was staggering and a testament to the might of the American wartime economy. In a remarkably short period, from 1942 to 1944, a total of 175 Fletcher-class destroyers were built in shipyards across the country. They slid into the water at an astonishing rate, a veritable flood of gray steel that the Japanese shipbuilding industry, with its limited resources, simply could not hope to match. This mass production was not just about numbers. It was about creating a standardized, reliable, and highly effective platform that could be deployed across the entire Pacific Fleet. As these new ships began to arrive in the South Pacific in late 1942 and early 1943, they brought with them not just more guns and more speed, but a fundamentally new capability. They were the physical embodiment of the American response to the challenges of the Night War. They were the ships that would carry the new electronic eyes, and with them, they would begin the systematic process of hunting the ghosts that had haunted Ironbottom Sound. The era of the Fletcher was about to begin. Section 5. The Electronic Dawn, a revolution on a flickering screen. The arrival of the Fletcher-class destroyers in the Pacific theater was more than just a reinforcement of numbers. It heralded a fundamental paradigm shift in the nature of naval warfare. The heart of this transformation was not in the steel of their hulls or the power of their guns, but in the delicate and complex arrangement of vacuum tubes, wiring, and antennas that comprise the SG surface search radar system. This piece of equipment, often housed in a small, unassuming dome atop the ship's mast, was the single most important technological innovation of the Pacific Naval War. It was an invention that would effectively abolish the night, turning the greatest tactical advantage of the Imperial Japanese Navy into a fatal liability. To the sailors who first encountered it, the SG radar was a strange and almost magical device. On the bridge, or in the newly established Combat Information Center, CIC, a darkened room filled with plotting tables and communication equipment, the radar operator would sit hunched over a circular screen known as the Plan Position Indicator, or PPI. The screen glowed with a soft, ethereal green light. In its center was a point of light representing their own ship. A faint line, the sweep of the radar beam, rotated around this center point like the hand of a clock, painting a ghostly, ephemeral map of the world around them. Land masses appeared as fuzzy, irregular shapes. Rain squalls showed up as hazy, shifting clouds. And most importantly, other ships appeared as sharp, distinct points of light, or pips. For the first time, a ship's commander could see a comprehensive, 360-degree view of his tactical environment, in real time, regardless of the weather or the time of day. The psychological impact of this capability cannot be overstated. For months, American sailors had operated in a state of constant, gnawing tension in the darkness, their eyes straining against the gloom, knowing that a superior enemy could be lurking just beyond the edge of their vision. The SG radar swept away that uncertainty. It replaced fear of the unknown with the cold, hard certainty of electronic data. A commander could now see an approaching enemy formation at a range of 20 miles or more, far beyond the visual horizon, even on a clear day, let alone a moonless night. He could see the enemy's formation, count the number of ships, and track their course and speed with incredible accuracy. The tactical initiative, which had so long belonged to the Japanese, was suddenly and irrevocably seized by any American ship equipped with this new eye. The Combat Information Center became the nerve center of the modern warship. Here, information from the SG radar, as well as from other sensors and lookouts, was collected, filtered, and displayed on a master plot. The ship's captain, standing in the CIC, could watch the entire battle unfold as a series of moving symbols on a chart. He could direct his ship's movements and coordinate the fire of his guns and torpedoes with a godlike omniscience that his Japanese counterparts, still relying on the fallible human eye, could not begin to comprehend. The integration of radar with gunnery was another revolutionary step. The fire control radars, linked to the Mark 37 gunfire control system, could lock on to a specific target identified by the SG radar. This system would then automatically calculate the complex ballistic solution needed to hit a moving target at a range of several miles, factoring in the ship's own motion, the wind, and the curvature of the Earth. The gun crews, deep inside their enclosed steel mounts, might never even see their target. They would simply load the guns, which would then be trained and elevated automatically by the fire control director high in the superstructure. When the firing key was closed, the 5-inch guns would unleash a salvo that was guided not by sight, but by the invisible pulses of radio waves. This was known as blind firing, and its accuracy was astonishing. American destroyers could now engage and hit enemy ships that were completely invisible to the naked eye, hidden by darkness, rain, or smoke. The Japanese doctrine of closing in for a torpedo attack before opening fire was completely undone. They would now find themselves bracketed by accurate, radar-directed shellfire from an enemy they could not see, often before they were even in a position to launch their own vaunted long-lance torpedoes. The initial Japanese encounters with this new American capability were baffling and deeply unsettling. Japanese after-action reports from this period are filled with accounts of their formations coming under surprisingly accurate fire at extreme ranges at night, with no visible sign of the enemy. They speculated about the use of new types of star shells or exceptionally skilled lookouts, but the truth was far more technologically profound. One Japanese destroyer captain famously reported, "It seemed the Americans could see in the dark." This was not hyperbole. It was a simple statement of fact. The electronic dawn had arrived, and the tactical landscape of the Pacific had been permanently altered. Of course, the technology was not perfect. Early radar sets could be temperamental, and interpreting the ghostly images on the PPI scope was an art that required skill and practice. Operators had to learn to filter out sea return, the clutter caused by radar waves bouncing off the surface of the ocean, and to distinguish real targets from false echoes, or ghosts. But the U.S. Navy invested heavily in training. Radar operator schools were established, and a new generation of sailors, comfortable with this new technology, began to populate the CICs of the fleet. They learned to trust the electronic picture of the world presented to them on the screen, even when it contradicted what their own eyes were telling them. This fusion of man and machine, of human intuition and electronic precision, was the key to unlocking the full potential of radar. The Fletcher-class destroyers, with their dedicated CIC spaces and advanced electronic suites, were the perfect platforms to pioneer these new tactics. As more and more of them arrived in the war zone, they began to systematically hunt the night predators of the Japanese Navy, using their newfound vision to turn the tables on the masters of the night. The era of the ambush was over. The era of the electronically orchestrated hunt had begun. Section 6. The Hunters Awaken. Early Successes and Shifting Tides. The transition from a state of nocturnal vulnerability to one of dominance did not happen overnight. It was a gradual, incremental process, built on a series of small but significant encounters where the new Fletcher-class destroyers and their revolutionary radar systems began to prove their worth. These early engagements, fought in the same dark, treacherous waters that had been the scene of so many previous defeats, were crucial for building confidence in the new technology and for developing the tactics that would maximize its effectiveness. They were the first tremors that signaled the coming earthquake in Pacific naval strategy. One of the key figures in this tactical evolution was Commander Arleigh Burke, a brilliant and aggressive destroyer squadron commander. Burke was a passionate advocate for the new radar technology. He understood that it was more than just a detection device. It was a tool that enabled a whole new philosophy of offensive night combat. He drilled his destroyer crews relentlessly, not just in gunnery and seamanship, but in the new art of fighting from the Combat Information Center. His ships practiced tracking targets on radar, coordinating their movements without visual signals, and executing complex torpedo and gunnery attacks based entirely on electronic data. He fostered an environment of innovation, encouraging his officers to experiment and to trust the flickering green scopes over their own instincts. Burke's squadron, and others like it, became the vanguard of this new type of warfare. The first clear signs that the tide was turning came in a series of skirmishes in early and mid-1943. While not large-scale, decisive battles, these actions demonstrated the new reality. A typical encounter would begin with a Fletcher-class destroyer on patrol, its SG radar antenna silently sweeping the horizon. The radar operator, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the PPI scope, would be the first to know that the enemy was near. A faint pip would appear at the edge of the screen, at a range of 10 or 12 miles. The contact would be reported to the CIC, where a plotting team would immediately begin to track its course and speed. The ship's captain, now armed with precise information, had all the advantages. He knew the enemy's position, heading, and composition, while the Japanese force, steaming confidently through the darkness, remained completely oblivious. The American commander could now choose the time and place of the engagement. He could maneuver his ship or his squadron into a perfect firing position, often crossing the T of the enemy formation, a classic naval maneuver that allowed his ships to bring all their guns to bear, while the enemy could only reply with their forward batteries. The Japanese sailors, relying on their superb night vision, would continue to scan the horizon, seeing nothing but the empty Black Sea. Their first indication of danger would be the sudden, shocking eruption of waterspouts around their ships as the first salvo of radar-directed 5-inch shells arrived. The effect was psychologically devastating. To be accurately engaged by an unseen enemy from out of the complete darkness was a terrifying experience. It shattered their carefully cultivated confidence and sowed confusion and disarray in their formations. Even if the initial salvos did not score direct hits, they forced the Japanese ships to take evasive action, breaking up their formations and disrupting any planned torpedo attack. The long lance was still a potent weapon, but it was useless if its launching platform was dodging for its life under a hail of accurate shellfire. The American destroyers could stand off at a safe distance, outside the effective visual range of the Japanese lookouts, and systematically dismantle the enemy formation with their superior radar-guided gunnery. One illustrative engagement, though small, highlighted this new dynamic perfectly. A pair of Fletchers on patrol detected a small group of Japanese destroyers on a Tokyo Express run. Instead of charging in for a close-range brawl, the American commander held his position, allowing the CIC to develop a clear firing solution. When the Japanese ships entered the optimal gunnery range, both Fletchers opened fire in unison. The first salvos were perfectly on target, straddling the lead Japanese destroyer. The Japanese force, taken completely by surprise, immediately turned to flee, firing a hasty and inaccurate salvo of torpedoes in the general direction of the muzzle flashes. The Fletchers, tracking the retreating ships on radar, continued to fire, scoring several hits and inflicting significant damage before the Japanese managed to escape into a rain squall. The American ships suffered no damage and no casualties. This type of encounter was repeated with increasing frequency. The myth of Japanese nocturnal invincibility began to crumble, replaced by a growing awareness within the Japanese Navy that the Americans had developed a mysterious and highly effective new capability. Their operational reports started to carry a new, worried tone, speaking of the uncanny ability of American ships to find them in the dark and to land shells with their opening salvos. These early successes were not just tactical victories. They were a profound morale booster for the American sailors. The fear of the night began to recede, replaced by a new, aggressive confidence. The Fletcher-class destroyers, with their speed, power, and electronic eyes, were no longer just escorts or pickets. They were becoming the premier night-fighting predators of the Pacific. They began to actively seek out the Tokyo Express, turning from the hunted into the hunters. The waters of the Slot, once the exclusive hunting ground of the Imperial Japanese Navy, were becoming an increasingly dangerous place for them to operate. While the Long Lance remained a weapon to be respected and feared, the Fletcher-class destroyers, guided by the unwavering gaze of their radar, had found the means to counter it. They were learning to fight a new kind of war, a war of electrons and algorithms, and in doing so, they were setting the stage for a truly decisive confrontation that would permanently shatter the Japanese mastery of the night. Section 7. The Vella Gulf Ambush, a perfect execution. By August of 1943, the lessons learned in the crucible of the Solomons had coalesced into a potent and well-rehearsed tactical doctrine. The Fletcher-class destroyers were no longer just platforms for a new technology. They were the core of a new system of naval warfare. The crews were now experienced. The radar operators were skilled artists at interpreting their screens, and the commanders were confident in their ability to use their technological edge to achieve decisive results. The perfect opportunity to demonstrate the full power of this new doctrine came on the night of August 6, 1943, in an action that would become a textbook example of a radar-assisted ambush, the Battle of Vella Gulf. The strategic situation was familiar. The Japanese were once again attempting a Tokyo Express run, this time to deliver troops and supplies to the island of Kolombangara. The force assigned to the mission consisted of 4 of their finest destroyers: Hagikaze, Arashi, Kawakaze, and Shigure. These were fast, well-armed ships, crewed by veterans of the Solomons campaign and commanded by the capable Captain Kaju Segura. They were confident in their ability to navigate the dark waters and fend off any opposition, relying on the time-tested tactics that had served them so well in the past. Waiting for them in the Vella Gulf, the body of water between Kolombangara and Vella La Vella, was an American task group composed of 6 destroyers, all from the new generation of warships. Under the command of Commander Frederick Moosbrugger, this force was divided into 2 divisions. Moosbrugger's own division consisted of the USS Dunlap, USS Craven, and USS Maury. The 2nd Division, under the command of Commander Arleigh Burke, though Burke himself was not present that night, having been ordered to a conference, his well-trained subordinates were in command, comprised the USS Stack, USS Sterrett, and USS Lang. Moosbrugger's battle plan was a model of simplicity and a direct product of the new radar-centric tactics. He would not engage in a chaotic, close-range gun battle. Instead, he would use his superior detection capabilities to set a trap. His own division, the Torpedo Division, would remain hidden and use their radar to launch a devastating torpedo attack from the darkness. The second division, the Gun Division, would be positioned to open fire only after the torpedoes had struck, finishing off any crippled ships and preventing any effective counterattack. The entire operation was designed to maximize the element of surprise and leverage the American technological advantage to its fullest. As darkness fell, Moosbrugger's destroyers took up their assigned positions, maintaining complete radio silence and showing no lights. The night was pitch black, with no moon and a low cloud cover, perfect conditions for an ambush. On board the American ships, the only light came from the dim red glow of the instrument panels and the soft green luminescence of the radar screens in the CICs. Shortly before midnight, the calm in the CIC of the USS Dunlap was broken. A radar operator, his eyes fixed on the scope, reported a clear contact. "Radar contact, bearing 315, range 18 miles. The plotters went to work, and soon a clear picture emerged. 4 distinct pips, moving in a tight column formation at high speed. It was the Tokyo Express, steaming directly into their trap, completely unaware of the 6 American destroyers lying in wait. Moosbrugger watched the plot, a picture of calm confidence. He had them. He allowed the Japanese column to advance deeper into the Gulf, letting the range decrease to the optimal point for a torpedo launch. His orders were precise and delivered with quiet efficiency over the tactical radio circuit. The 3 destroyers of his torpedo division altered course slightly, bringing their torpedo tubes to bear on the unsuspecting Japanese column. The Japanese lookouts, straining their eyes into the impenetrable blackness, saw nothing. Their ship's companies were at a relaxed state of readiness, not expecting any contact until they were much closer to their destination. At 11:41 p.m., with the Japanese destroyers at a range of just over 4,000 yards, Moosbrugger gave the order. "Fire torpedoes." On the decks of the Dunlap, Craven, and Maury, there was a series of loud hisses as compressed air ejected the Mark 15 torpedoes from their tubes. A total of 24 torpedoes slid into the dark water, their propellers beginning to spin as they accelerated towards their targets. Unlike the wakeless, long lances, these torpedoes left a faint trail, but in the total darkness, they were effectively invisible. The American ships, having fired their salvo, immediately turned away at high speed, presenting their narrow sterns to the enemy and preparing for any counterattack. For several agonizingly long minutes, there was nothing but the sound of the American engines and the thrumming of the sea. Then, the night exploded. A series of brilliant, violent flashes lit up the Japanese column. The torpedoes had found their mark. The destroyers, Hagekaze, Arashi, and Kawakaze, were all struck by multiple torpedoes. The explosions were catastrophic, igniting fuel and ammunition stores. Within minutes, the 3 ships were transformed into blazing pyres, their silhouettes starkly illuminated against the night sky. The 4th Japanese destroyer, the Shigure, commanded by the famously lucky Captain Tamechi Hara, had a miraculous escape. A torpedo passed directly under its bridge without exploding. Hara, a skilled and experienced commander, reacted instantly, ordering a hard turn and firing a retaliatory spread of 8 long lance torpedoes into the darkness. But he was firing blind. At muzzle flashes he could not properly identify. His torpedoes ran their course without finding a target. The Shigure, the sole survivor, then fled the scene at maximum speed. Now, it was the turn of the American gun division. With the enemy formation shattered and illuminated by the raging fires, they opened fire with their 5-inch guns. Their radar-directed salvos were mercilessly accurate, pouring a torrent of high-explosive shells into the burning hulks of the Japanese destroyers. The engagement was over in less than 45 minutes. 3 Japanese destroyers were sunk, with a heavy loss of life. The American force suffered no damage and no casualties whatsoever. The Battle of Vella Gulf was a stunning, unqualified success. It was the polar opposite of the disaster at Savo Island a year earlier. It was a victory achieved not through brute force, but through superior intelligence, meticulous planning, and the flawless application of technology. It demonstrated beyond any doubt that the tactical advantage in the night battles of the Pacific had decisively shifted. The ghosts of Ironbottom Sound had not just been seen. They had been exorcised by the relentless, all-seeing electronic gaze of the Fletcher-class destroyers. The masters of the night had been dethroned. Section 8. An Unraveling Doctrine and the Widening Gap. The stunningly one-sided outcome of the Battle of Vella Gulf was more than just a tactical defeat for the Imperial Japanese Navy. It was an indictment of a doctrine that had suddenly become obsolete. The news of the loss of 3 destroyers, ambushed and annihilated by an enemy they never saw, sent a profound shock through the Japanese Naval Command. For over a year, they had operated with a sense of near invincibility in the darkness, their confidence rooted in the proven superiority of their training, their optics, and their long-lance torpedoes. Now, that confidence was shattered, replaced by a growing and deeply unsettling mystery. How were the Americans doing it? The initial reports from survivors, like Captain Hara of the Shigure, were filled with confusion. They spoke of coming under accurate fire from impossible ranges, of being tracked in pitch-black conditions as if it were broad daylight. The Japanese intelligence services struggled to find an explanation. They considered new types of flashless powder for the American guns, the use of infrared detection devices, or even a network of coast watchers feeding real-time information to the American fleet. The concept of a shipboard radar system, as powerful and precise as the American SG, was beyond their immediate comprehension, as it represented a technological leap that their own industry was not yet capable of making. This lack of understanding placed the Japanese at a severe disadvantage. They were fighting an enemy whose primary weapon they could not see, counter, or even properly identify. Their entire night-fighting philosophy, which was predicated on achieving visual surprise and launching a first-strike torpedo attack, was systematically being dismantled. The 2 pillars of their nocturnal supremacy, the keen-eyed lookout and the long lance, were being neutralized. The human eye, no matter how well trained, could not compete with the penetrating gaze of microwave radar. The long lance, for all its power and range, was a weapon that required a target whose position was known. As the American Fletchers grew more adept at detecting Japanese forces from afar, they could maneuver to avoid the likely paths of torpedo attacks or, more devastatingly, destroy the launching ships before they could even fire. The Japanese Navy found itself in a desperate reactive posture. They began to experiment with new tactics to counter the unseen threat. They tried sending scout planes ahead of their formations, hoping to detect the American ships before they came within radar range. They attempted to use their own destroyers as bait, hoping to draw the American forces into a prearranged trap. Some commanders advocated for a return to daylight actions, where their superior optics and gunnery skills might still hold an advantage. But this was often not an option, due to the overwhelming American air superiority radiating from Henderson Field and the growing number of aircraft carriers. The Japanese did have radar technology of their own, but it was several generations behind what the Americans were fielding. Their early sets were bulky, unreliable, and lacked the crucial plan position indicator, PPI scope, that gave American operators such a clear tactical picture. Japanese radar typically provided only range and bearing to a single target, and it was far less effective at distinguishing between ships or detecting low-profile targets like destroyers. Furthermore, Japan's industrial base, strained by the demands of a multi-front war and limited access to resources, could not produce advanced electronics in the quantity or quality required. While the Americans were mass-producing hundreds of sophisticated SG radar sets and installing them on virtually every new destroyer and cruiser, the Japanese struggled to equip even their capital ships with their less effective systems. This created a rapidly widening technological gap that had profound strategic consequences. The Tokyo Express became an increasingly perilous and costly operation. The steady flow of reinforcements and supplies to their isolated island garrisons began to dry up. The American Navy, led by its radar-equipped Fletcher-class destroyers, established a suffocating nocturnal blockade around the Japanese positions. Control of the seas, and therefore the outcome of the land campaigns in the Solomons and beyond, was increasingly being decided by the men watching the glowing green screens in the CICs of the American fleet. The psychological impact on the Japanese sailors was immense. The night, once their trusted ally, was now filled with a new and terrifying menace. The confidence and aggressive spirit that had characterized their operations in 1942 began to erode, replaced by a grim sense of caution and a feeling of technological inferiority. They were forced to adapt their proud, offensive doctrine into one of mere survival. Their destroyers, once the feared predators of the night, were now the prey, hunted by an enemy who seemed to possess a supernatural ability to see through the darkness. The unraveling of their night-fighting doctrine was a symptom of a larger strategic problem. Japan had gambled on a short, decisive war, believing that its martial spirit and tactical brilliance could overcome the material superiority of the United States. The Fletcher-class destroyer and its SG radar were the definitive proof that this gamble had failed. They were the products of a system that could innovate, mass-produce, and deploy technology at a scale that Japan could not match. Each new Fletcher that joined the fleet, with its advanced electronics and well-trained crew, was another nail in the coffin of Japan's maritime ambitions. The war at sea had become a war of technology, and it was a war that Japan was now inexorably losing. The stage was being set for a final, cataclysmic series of naval battles where this technological disparity would be demonstrated on the grandest and most tragic of scales. Section 9. The Gauntlet of Surigao Strait. Night's Final Verdict. The culmination of the revolution in naval night warfare, the ultimate demonstration of the supremacy of radar-guided tactics, occurred in the pre-dawn hours of October 25, 1944. It was a battle fought not in the open sea, but within the narrow, confining waters of Surigao Strait in the Philippines. This engagement, a key component of the larger Battle of Leyte Gulf, stands as one of the most perfectly executed and brutally one-sided naval actions in history. It was the final, thunderous verdict on the question of who had mastered the night. The Japanese strategic plan for the defense of the Philippines was a complex and desperate gamble called Shogo 1. It called for luring the main American carrier fleet away with a decoy force, allowing two powerful Japanese surface fleets to converge on the American invasion beaches at Leyte Gulf and annihilate the vulnerable transport ships. The Southern Force, commanded by Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura, was tasked with forcing a passage through Surigao Strait to attack the invasion fleet from the south. Nishimura's force was a remnant of the once mighty Imperial Japanese Navy, consisting of two old but still powerful battleships, Fuso and Yamashiro, the heavy cruiser Mogami, and 4 destroyers. Confident in his crew's night-fighting skills and adhering to a rigid sense of duty, Nishimura steamed towards the strait, unaware that he was heading into the most elaborate and deadly trap ever laid in the history of naval warfare. Waiting for him was the American 7th Fleet Support Force, commanded by Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf. Oldendorf was a methodical and experienced commander, and he had at his disposal a massive concentration of naval power. More importantly, he had time to prepare his reception for Nishimura's force. He deployed his assets in a classic defensive posture of layered depth, designed to wear down and destroy the advancing enemy long before they could reach his main battle line. The first layer of this defense consisted of dozens of PT boats, small, fast patrol boats armed with torpedoes, scattered throughout the southern end of the strait. Their mission was to harry and disrupt the Japanese column. The second, and far more lethal layer, consisted of multiple squadrons of destroyers, including many veteran Fletcher-class ships. These destroyers were positioned along both sides of the narrow strait, hidden in the darkness near the shore. Their orders were to execute coordinated, radar-guided torpedo attacks on the Japanese column as it passed. The final layer, the steel wall at the northern end of the strait, was Oldendorf's main battle line. It consisted of 6 old American battleships, many of them veterans of Pearl Harbor, that had been salvaged and rebuilt, supported by a powerful screen of heavy and light cruisers. Oldendorf had positioned his battle line directly across the strait's exit, perfectly crossing Nishimura's T. This meant that every single battleship and cruiser in the American line could bring its full broadside firepower to bear on the approaching Japanese ships, which could only reply with their forward-facing guns. As Nishimura's force entered the strait after midnight, the trap was sprung. The first to strike were the PT boats, which darted in and out of the darkness, launching torpedoes and radioing detailed contact reports back to Oldendorf. While they scored no significant hits, their persistent attacks forced the Japanese ships to maneuver and alerted the entire column that they had been detected, shattering any hope of a surprise passage. Then came the destroyers. From the darkened shorelines, squadron after squadron of American destroyers emerged to launch their attacks. This was the moment for which the Fletcher-class and its crews had been trained. In the combat information centers, the glowing green PPI scopes showed the Japanese column as a neat line of pips moving inexorably up the center of the strait. The American destroyer commanders, with a godlike view of the battlefield, timed their attacks to perfection. They unleashed hundreds of torpedoes from both sides of the Japanese formation, creating an inescapable web of destruction. The USS Rimae and her division were among the first to strike, launching their torpedoes and turning away without ever being visually sighted by the enemy. The Japanese battleship Fuso was struck by 1, then 2 torpedoes. The damage was catastrophic. The grand old ship, her fuel stores ignited, broke in 2 and sank, turning into a massive, blazing funeral pyre. Nishimura, in his flagship Yamashiro, pressed on, his sense of duty overriding the unfolding disaster around him. But his force was being systematically dismantled. The destroyers Michishio, Asagumo, and Yamagumo were all hit by torpedoes and either sunk or left dead in the water. The heavy cruiser Mogami was also hit and fell out of formation, crippled and burning. The Yamashiro, now almost alone, continued its solitary advance up the strait, directly towards Oldendorf's waiting battle line. The scene on the bridges of the American battleships and cruisers was one of surreal, clinical precision. The Japanese ships were still invisible to the naked eye, miles away in the darkness. But on the radar screens of the fire control systems, they were clear, sharp targets. The fire control plotters tracked the Yamashiro's every move, their calculations relayed electrically to the massive guns of the battle line. Admiral Oldendorf gave the order, and the night erupted in a cataclysm of sound and light. The main batteries of 6 battleships and 8 cruisers opened fire in unison. A torrent of 14-inch and 16-inch armor-piercing shells, guided by the unerring accuracy of radar, screamed through the darkness and converged on the single point of light that represented the Yamashiro on their screens. For Admiral Nishimura and his crew, the end was apocalyptic. They were suddenly engulfed in a man-made hurricane of steel and high explosives. Shell after shell slammed into their ship, tearing through its armor, causing massive internal explosions, and turning its superstructure into a twisted wreck. The Yamashiro, battered by countless heavy-caliber hits and at least one more torpedo, slowed, capsized, and sank, taking Admiral Nishimura and the vast majority of his crew with her. The Battle of Surigao Strait was over. Nishimura's southern force had ceased to exist. In the space of a few hours, 2 battleships, a heavy cruiser, and 3 destroyers had been sunk. The sole surviving Japanese ship, the destroyer Shigure, once again miraculously escaped, but was heavily damaged. The American force, in achieving this overwhelming victory, had suffered only minor damage to 1 destroyer. It was the most decisive night victory in naval history, a perfect testament to the power of radar, well-executed tactics, and overwhelming firepower. The Gauntlet of Surigao Strait was the final, brutal chapter in the story of the Night War. The ghosts that had once haunted the darkness of the Pacific had been well and truly laid to rest, their demise orchestrated by the electronic eyes and relentless firepower of the ships that had been built to hunt them. Section 10. The Echo of a New Era. Legacy of the Fletcher-class. The Battle of Surigao Strait was more than just a victory. It was the definitive end of an era. The age of naval combat decided by the keenest eye and the boldest seamanship in the darkness was over. A new era had dawned, one dominated by electronics, information, and the ability to process that information into decisive action. The Fletcher-class destroyers, serving as the primary architects of this new reality, had not just won a series of battles. They had fundamentally and permanently altered the principles of warfare at sea. Their legacy is a complex tapestry woven from threads of technological innovation, tactical evolution, and sheer industrial might. In the immediate aftermath of the great naval battles of 1944, the role of the Fletchers continued to evolve. With the Imperial Japanese Navy largely shattered as an effective fighting force, the destroyers transitioned from their role as night fighting predators to that of indispensable fleet workhorses. They formed the critical anti-aircraft and anti-submarine screens for the vast American carrier task forces that were now projecting power all the way to the shores of Japan itself. Their 5-inch guns, guided by the same radars that had devastated Japanese fleets in the dark, proved equally effective at providing fire support for the brutal island-hopping campaigns, from Iwo Jima to Okinawa. They pounded shore installations, broke up enemy counterattacks, and protected the vulnerable troop transports, performing their duties with the same tireless efficiency that had defined them throughout the war. Their robust design and adaptability, which had been a hallmark from their conception, continued to pay dividends. As the nature of the threat shifted from surface fleets to the desperate, fanatical attacks of kamikaze aircraft, the Fletchers were once again upgraded. Their anti-aircraft armament was continually enhanced, their radar suites improved, and their crews trained in the new, high-stakes discipline of fending off suicide attacks. They formed the outer picket line of the fleet, the radar pickets, standing as the first line of defense, absorbing the brunt of the kamikaze onslaught to protect the high-value carriers. It was a grueling and dangerous duty, but one they performed with characteristic valor and resilience. When the guns finally fell silent in August of 1945, the 175 Fletcher-class destroyers had carved out an unparalleled combat record. They had fought in every major naval campaign of the Pacific War, from the dark days in the Solomons to the final victory. They had earned their reputation as one of the most successful warship designs in history, not merely through their numbers, but through their profound impact on the course of the war. The legacy of the Fletcher-class extends far beyond the Second World War. Their durable and versatile design meant that, unlike many other wartime ships, they were not immediately destined for the scrapyard. Many Fletchers continued to serve in the United States Navy for decades, seeing action in the Korean War and the Vietnam War, their hulls updated with new weapons and sensors. A testament to the soundness of their original design, they were able to adapt to the new challenges of the Cold War era, from guided missiles to sophisticated submarines. Furthermore, dozens of Fletcher-class destroyers were transferred to the navies of allied nations around the world. For the latter half of the 20th century, these former Greyhounds of the Pacific served under the flags of Germany, Japan, Spain, Greece, Brazil, and many other countries. They became the backbone of these post-war navies, training a new generation of sailors and carrying the legacy of their innovative design across the globe. Some of these ships served for an incredible 4 decades, a remarkable lifespan for a vessel designed and built under the pressures of a world at war. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Fletcher-class, however, is conceptual. They represent a pivotal moment in the history of naval technology, the point at which the ship ceased to be just a platform for weapons and became an integrated information and combat system. The Combat Information Center, which was pioneered and perfected on these destroyers, is the direct ancestor of the sophisticated command and control centers found on every modern warship today. The principle of using networked sensors, like radar, to build a comprehensive tactical picture and to guide weapons to their targets with precision is the very foundation of modern naval warfare. The sailors who learned to trust the ghostly pips on a green screen in 1943 were the pioneers of a new way of fighting that is now standard practice across all branches of the military. In a broader, more humanistic sense, the story of the Fletchers is a story of adaptation and ingenuity in the face of a formidable challenge. It is a narrative about how a nation, when faced with a determined and skillful adversary, responded not just with greater force, but with greater intelligence. The victory over the Japanese masters of the night was not simply a triumph of industrial production. It was a triumph of scientific innovation, tactical flexibility, and the courage of the sailors who embraced a new and unfamiliar way of seeing the world. The echoes of those night battles in the Pacific still resonate today. They are present in the silent, sweeping beams of radar on every ship and airfield, a constant reminder that the ability to see in the dark, to perceive what is hidden, remains the ultimate advantage. The Fletcher-class destroyers were the vessels that first carried that advantage into the heart of the fight, and in doing so, they did not just win a war, they forged a new era.